Okay, we're going to continue chapter 2, page 29. Last week we ended with this wonderful analogy. He says it's like when thick clouds obscure the sun. If the wind doesn't blow, the sun cannot shine. That finished a long passage where he was talking about this inherent essential nature, or the prajna that we all have innate, which is like the sun, and then the clouds of klesha or afflictions, sometimes called the defiling passions, impediments that obscure that sun. So the sun itself is never changed by them. It's just between the clouds and the sun arises this obscuration momentarily. And then he says the wind doesn't blow, the sun cannot shine. The wind being, again, the cultivation, the self-cultivation that dispels the clouds and brings about the inherent wisdom again. And now he goes on, and he says not only is it this way, but he says that prajna wisdom is itself neither great nor small. But living beings differ because their own minds are either awakened or confused. Those with confused minds who look outwardly in their cultivation in search of the Buddha have not yet awakened to their essential nature. Just this is small roots. And then he contrasts this with, he says, if you've awakened to the direct teaching, you do not cultivate by grasping at externals. You simply uphold right views constantly in your own mind. The defiling passions never stain you. Just this is seeing the self-nature, seeing the essential nature. So he's used a number of ideas or expressions here that occur throughout these teaching. Inward, outwardly is one of the parallels or, dualisms that he's playing off of here. Small roots and great roots, or shallow roots and deep roots. And then direct teaching as opposed to provisional teaching. His teaching is towards the great roots, the deep roots. It's towards the direct teaching. And it's towards inward versus outward. And we should go through some of this just to be clear a little bit what he's talking about. Earlier, remember he said on the previous page, he encourages to cultivate the practice of prajna, recite the Diamond Sutra by heart. And so you would think this passage might seem to be maybe a contradiction to that, because here he's talking about not reciting prajna, but cultivating your own essential nature, looking within, and not relying on externals. So this passage here could seem to contradict this. I don't think it does, for a couple of reasons. One, the memorization of a text, of a sutra, has been long used for a number of purposes in self-cultivation. One, of course, it goes back to the fact that the teachings of the Buddha, as we understand them now, written down, and even this text, was transmitted orally. Sixth Patriarch didn't write. These were records recorded by his disciples, and the same is true of the Buddha himself. He didn't write. And so one of the techniques for preserving the teachings was to commit them to memory and pass them along generation from generation in an oral tradition. So in a very practical sense, the preservation of these teachings depended on, for a long time, memorization. So that was the first thing about memorization. It wasn't magical or mystical in any sense. It was just keeping the teachings alive in the only way that was available at that time, which was word of mouth, orally. When they came to be written down, you might say, well, then the purpose of the memorization was fulfilled, and there'd be no more reason to do that. However, memorization was maintained, again, for a number of reasons. One, there wasn't sort of absolute confidence that that which was written down would last. And of course, we talked about this last paper. Ink fades, disappears. And even stones, if you carve them on stones, can erode and crack and be lost, destroyed during revolutions. Emperors change their minds and can destroy whole libraries overnight, and also the librarians, and also the people that wrote the books. And so the preservation of a body of knowledge, of wisdom, is fragile. It's fragile at many levels. It's fragile on the just practical level of maintaining it, but it's fragile even on the level of understanding it and transmitting the spirit, and not just the letter of it. And so the memorization was meant to, one, keep the preservation going in the midst of the vicissitudes of nature and revolutions and contrary type people, but it was also to imbue oneself with a spirit. There was a feeling, and some of you who practice memorization maybe share this, that when you memorize a text, and especially the monks and nuns who are doing this, but lay people, of course, as well, you enter a state of, I would say, a kind of profound mindfulness or a samadhi of concentration. And while you're in that state, with all your faculties bearing on committing these sentences and phrases to memory, you're not doing a lot of other things that, in the spiritual sense, are considered to be distracting or dispersing your energy. So the mere act of memorization is a form of meditation, in a sense. It's a form of concentration, bringing your emotions, your energy, your thoughts, your feelings into a single focus of concentration. And that in itself, often even independent of what you're memorizing, has salutary effects of mindfulness and the calming of emotions and so forth. But even more so, if the content of what you're memorizing is rich and profound and uplifting and wholesome, then you're, in a sense, you're eating good food. You're eating a rich nutrient that will sustain you not only immediately, but I found, and I think other people have found that have done this, it's like you're taking in seeds that, when they're memorized, later on will blossom and open in the most unexpected times when something happens. Some event happens, a good event, a bad event, some moment of insight, and often at that time the text that you memorize comes to reinforce and almost like stamp a seal of understanding on that event. And this in Chinese is they call the interconnection, the interpenetration of Li and Shi, of principle or theory and specifics of the concretes, the abstract and the concrete of one's life. And so, in a sense, you become a living text, and that tradition of the text, the wisdoms in the text, starts to flow through your veins, so to speak, and becomes part of you. And it helps inform and also make sense of, explain the experiences you're having. And so it's like having a good and wise advisor, a mentor, a sage, just over your shoulder, just giving you these words of counsel and insight. And often the memorization doesn't make sense at the beginning. And sometimes it takes months or years for various connections to happen. But it's certainly a good use of time. I would say it's a lot better than channel surfing, both for the content and the deviant samadhi you enter by doing that. But it enriches in very subtle ways. So the memorization he's talking about here is not simply rote memorization, but really a kind of absorption of both the letter and the spirit of the text, so that you start to merge with it. So then when he goes to this section, what he's talking about here is continuing the idea of self-cultivation. He never says here that just memorization of a text is sufficient for awakening and liberation. It's conducive to, it's supportive of, it's a supplement, it's a aid, but it doesn't take the place of. And in some cases, people memorize text also because, for the same reason the early disciples did after the Buddha was gone, it was sort of what they had left of a rope or a thread to hold on to steer by in their practice. And so by having those teachings available, they could refer to them when they had doubts, misunderstandings, missteps, made mistakes. How do we recorrect and go? And the same thing happens if you memorize these texts. Even if you don't have a living, breathing, wise and trustworthy mentor, this can take the place in many ways to serve as that, a place to bounce off your ideas. So memorizing text is, for many reasons, a really good exercise in terms of self-cultivation, not as a substitute for self-cultivation. So I just want to be clear that that's what he's talking about here. When it says it's neither great or small, this is going back to the concept that if this essential nature that he's talking about, this Buddha nature, this awakened nature, is in fact whole and complete in every living being, then why are there differences? Why are there ordinary people? Why are there sages? Why are there degrees of sages, arhats, bodhisattvas? Why are there the other realms, including animals and ghosts and spirits and devas and so forth? And his explanation here is that it's a difference in functioning rather than in substance. The substance is the same, but the functioning differs. He says if their minds are awakened, then they have those great roots, and they're functioning at full capacity. However, if they're confused and they're looking outwardly, he puts these two together interestingly. If they're confused and looking outwardly in their cultivation in search of Buddha, and I would say you could leave this as small b, then they haven't awakened to this essential nature. They haven't realized that functional use of it, which is to open up one's inherent wisdom, to realize Buddhahood for oneself. So the looking outwardly very simply means that you're looking for liberation, understanding, knowledge, wisdom, the awakened insight, not through the cultivation of your own person, not through the rectification of your own faults and bad habits and so forth, but you're turning your attention to outward, external props and sources to bring it to you. So instead of getting it from your own being, you're looking outside for it to come to you in some kind of gift or magic or auspicious happening. And this gets really into then people who do this put a great deal of attention to external performances of rituals, devotions, and so forth. And again, I want to be clear that this is not to say they're wrong. It's the attitude with which you do them. And in fact, this is one of the wrong views that we're going to get to maybe tonight. I never know what I get to when I say I start that way, but we may or may not get to it. But one of the wrong views is having an obsessive attachment to precepts, rituals, rules, devotions as totally sufficient for liberation and awakening, thinking that and that alone will do it. So if you perform the rituals absolutely correctly and do them even sincerely, seeking for this and that, and thinking that's going to lead to the absence of klesha and the rising of the awakened mind is actually a wrong view. Now, it doesn't say that rituals, devotions, and so forth and precepts are wrong. No, that's not what's wrong. It's the attitude or view you have towards them. So instead of taking them as a sort of necessary but not sufficient thing towards concentration and cultivation, you replace your cultivation with that and that alone and saying, that will deliver me, that will save me if I'm only sincere. And it gets into not just the classic standard devotions of prayer and ritual and recitation, but into all the magical and mystical stuff too, with the signs and the omens and the portents, and you start really getting hung up on looking for those. So if you're looking outward, you're not only looking outward for that, but you're looking outward for any sign or indication that you're on the right track. Ooh, look at that comet. That must mean. Oh, look at that cloud. That looks like Guan Yin. That must mean. And we're in China, and I don't know if it was why this was, but on these tours, when you go to places, There's a whole mystique about these places as being embodiments of ghosts and spirits and the sages of the past, so that, I don't know what it's almost magical realism, if I can use that word. And so you're going down a river in a boat, and your guide is next to you, and you're just sort of looking at the trees and like, oh, look, what? There's Confucius in that rock, huh? Yeah, you see, oh, okay. And then you go next and something, oh, there's Lao Tzu in that tree, the old gnarl sage. And, you know, this goes on, and it's kind of like it gets going and you catch it. It's a little bit contagious, and you start seeing things. There's a great book written by an anthropologist called something like Heaven in the Clouds, and it's basically a study of how we project our longings for the divine into signs of importance, and we're looking and we imagine the clouds to be shaping up and giving us importance. And this leads to then divination and predictions and so forth. And this is universal human stuff. This doesn't just belong to one people or one time. It's everywhere. My devout Irish Catholic grandmother had it to the extreme. I won't go into the stories of this, but it seems to be a trope or a type that cuts across all religious and spiritual traditions. It exists in Reno and Las Vegas. It'll exist on the basketball games this weekend when players get up to do free throws. They'll do all these magic little rituals that they think will make the ball go through the hoop. And afterwards, some will claim that it was God's will that they won, or that the others lost. Deus levolt is the expression. Deus levolt, the will of God. Ironically, this was used in the Middle Ages during the Crusades, and both sides recited the same thing. Both sides used Deus levolt. God's on our side. God wills it. So, anyhow, this is all called looking outwardly. And the Sixth Patriarch here is saying, don't waste your time. This is just like gambling. The house has the odds. You're never going to win. This just doesn't work. Moreover, if you understand the true nature of cause and effect, you realize that results come about through effort and intentional action, and not through magic and external happenstance or luck. And that's why even in the Confucian text it says the superior person cultivates himself, the inferior, small-rooted person seeks for luck, seeks for bargains. And it has the same notion here that you take control of your destiny, for better or for worse, by your intention, by your actions, and so forth. And this is what it means to look inwardly. So I want to contrast this because looking inwardly doesn't mean contemplating your navel, okay? I mean, you can mistake this and think, well, looking outwardly is, we were clear about, but looking inwardly is some kind of inner introspection where you pull yourself away from the world and you're, and you're going really into your sort of oblivion, a meditative oblivion. And what inwardly means here, he means in the realities of your own existence, in the ground of your own being, in your relationships here and now, your family, your friends, in your own psyche, in your own emotional state. That ground, that is the ground of awakening, or the site of awakening, literally bodhi manda. The site of awakening is this ground. It's not just internal meditative introspection, which helps you attune to the ground, but it's the whole causes and conditions of your existence. That's why he says there is no awakening apart from this here and now world. If you look for it apart, separate from this here and now world, he says it's looking for a phantom, a chimera. Literally, he says a rabbit with antlers, which then didn't exist. I'm sure they do now, given genetic engineering. But at that time, there was no such thing as rabbits with antlers. And he said there's no such thing as a Buddha or sage. You got to be a Buddha or sage by escaping the existence that they were in, by denying it and pretending it wasn't a factor. You only get awakened by working through the kinks and the knots and the tangles of your own being and existence. That's the only way to do it. So escaping that means untying that. It means correcting that. It means straightening it out. There's no shortcuts. So when he says inwardly, he's talking about this inwardly and not some sort of zoned out introspection. That's not what he's talking about. In fact, later he'll criticize this as being a total misinterpretation of samadhi and meditation, of zoning out, of tuning out, and basically escaping, very interesting, escaping reality. So his notion is you don't escape reality, you actually confront it, you penetrate it, you turn it, and you take control of it, and transformed it becomes a Buddha land. Untransformed, it's just the pits, the dumps. Okay? So that's the idea here. So don't mistake the inwardly as something kind of withdrawal from reality. He says, if you awaken to the direct teaching, you do not cultivate by grasping after externals. You simply uphold right views constantly in your own mind, and the defiling passions, again, this is the word for klesha, never stain you. Just this is seeing the self-nature, seeing the essential nature. Just this is looking within, seeing it within yourself. In other words, by externals, you're not confused. You're really clear. As things arise, you see them really clearly. You don't grasp. Moreover, you're making sure that both emotionally and intellectually, you're right. And by right, I mean centered. Zheng. Now, this gets translated in English as right, but I think a better is to look at the Chinese character, which is actually a carpenter square, and it's for getting things set up correctly. It's about balance. It's about attunement. It's not about absolute right or moral right or philosophical, ideological right. This is about being in a position of intellect and emotion that it's working properly to attune you, to liberate you, to lead to the end of suffering, and so forth. And the Buddha always uses this language. Does it lead to this? Is it conducive to wholesomeness? What is kushala? If it does, then it's right, meaning correct in the doing of it. And if it doesn't, even if it's theoretically, quote, right, it's wrong. So the measure of right or wrong has to do with the results towards liberation and awakening that it's producing, and not with some abstract stance. And in fact, this is one of the views that the Buddha, why the Buddha got into these criticism of certain views. He said, if you hold these very strong absolute opinions that you're really invested in, even if they're correct theoretically, they can become a source of obstruction and won't liberate you, because you get into then wanting to be right and arguing with people. And so he actually called these views the wrangling of views, or the jungle of views. It's something that people got into, arguing back and forth, right or wrong, and so on and so forth, and actually thought by winning the argument they won the path, or they would get liberated. And it has nothing to do with winning arguments. And that's why later the Sixth Patriarch is very clear about this. He says, all these, he calls them Dharma doors, Fa Mun, but it means all the various spiritual practices, all the various sutras and texts, he says, are basically methods of practice. They aren't subjects of debate. This is his actual words. So he says, do them, try them, work with them, and if they are conducive to your liberation understanding, good. Don't sit around and debate and talk about them, which is better, or right or wrong, or worse. Because they're not methods, they're methods of cultivation, they're not subjects for debate. And that's why he says the mind of win and lose is a mind in opposition to the Tao. The mind of wanting to win and lose, of fighting and competing, is in opposition to the Tao. So if you're in that mind, whether you win or lose, you're still not on the path. So this is where he goes. And then he says, and then the defiling passions never stain you, is that combination. Now actually, if we look at this, I'll spend a little time on this tonight, because I generally make the statement that this teaching, like much of the teaching that comes out of the South and East Asian heritage or traditions, is orthopraxic in its orientation. Ortho means ortho. Yeah, right, like orthodontics, you straighten your teeth. So ortho means correcting straight, interesting. And then orthopraxic means it's right by the doing of it. Orthodoxic means It's right by the law of it, or the form of it. What do you call orthodoxic? Of the doctrine of it, that comes of the dogma of the doctrine. And so it's a priori right because of some authority that says so, either a book or a teacher or so forth. And so this tradition that we're part of and talking about here is more on the orthopraxic. In other words, something is made right or correct in its conduciveness to becoming a better person, to perfecting your humanity, to gaining liberation and insight. And that's how you know its rightness. It's in the doing of it. The orthodoxic is the rightness is in the word or the text or the idea of the concept. And however interesting that is to people of this was never the underlying measure of the good life in this tradition. It was whether this was conducive to becoming a good person, happy in the deepest sense, healthy, a contribution to yourself and to others and so forth. That was the measure. And so people chose teachers on the basis of whether they were conducive to that, rather than even their lineage or their purported expertise, theoretically. And you can see this, for example, even in the Vinaya for monks and nuns. In certain traditions, if it's orthodoxy, you can be taken to task for your wrong attitude or view. For example, you might say, I think the Trinity was a unity, or I think the unity was a Trinity. And in that, people would struggle with you, and if you didn't change your view, you could be eliminated, right? They burn your books, and if you didn't recant, they burn you. So orthodoxy was assert to the doctrine or the dogma of faith, no matter how good you were. You could be considered deviant and heretic and be, eliminated. In the Buddhist tradition, generally that doesn't happen. I would say almost universally it doesn't happen, and if it does happen, there's something misinterpreting going on. For example, even in the monastic code, I could get up as a monk in the morning and say, I don't think there's any Buddhas. And people just say, oh, he's having a bad hair day. Well, you wouldn't have a bad hair day because you shaved your head, but you were having a bad day. Okay, and they just ignore you. You wouldn't be kicked out of the community. But if you broke one of the precepts, you killed, you stole, you committed sexual misconduct, that would be grounds for expulsion. So you were expelled for your behavior that messed up the community's harmony and messed up cultivation, but you weren't expelled for your heterodoxy, if you want to use that word. Okay? So when he's talking about views here, we come across this, and everybody, if we didn't spend some time on this, you might just think, well, that's just like having a good opinion of something, or sort of a dispassionate idea. When he says, uphold right views constantly in your own minds. But this is actually much more than that, and that's why I wanted to define this tonight a little bit. The Sanskrit for this is dristi. How's my pronunciation? Well, Lauren's not here. It's fine. It's good, thank you. This is sort of a Dutch coming to America telling me my Sanskrit's fine. I'll take it. So dristi means a view or an opinion, but has two qualities. It's implying it's erroneous, and let me say why it's erroneous, again, going back to orthopraxy, and it's kind of speculative. In other words, it's not based on direct knowledge, but it's an idea held without real close direct knowledge, and it's erroneous in that it's tainted by, usually, what they call mula akushala, which is the roots of wrongness. And that's by some sense of grasping, thirst, greed, or some aversion or animosity, and then by some aspect of delusion or confusion. And when the view and the opinion is tainted by that, it tends to go wrong. The big ones, there's lots of them. There's 60-some, I think. And we don't have to go into 60-some tonight because that would be way too much. But we can hit on some of the major ones. One of the major ones goes around this notion of a self. Okay? So Yeah, our feelings about me and mine are emotional, but there's also an intellectual kind of layering that goes on with this idea of the self. And the first one is the view of the self as real and substantial. That's considered drishti. Now you might say, come on, hey, me, I'm here. Why is that drishti? And it's drishti because you're no more here than a flower or a bubble or a star. We are all of us here and not here. And we're all here and not here in the same moment sometimes, not just in our attention, but in the transformation. So we are constantly in flux and changing. You all remember before you were born? No, not really. So you weren't at one time, then you were. Well, you started as this little cell, if I understand my biology, and what is it, mitosis or meiosis? Which happens? What's cell division growth? Mitosis. Thank you. Drishti and mitosis, I'm getting a lot of help here. Science and Sanskrit are not my specialty. And so the cell divides and divides and divides, and something goes on for 9 months. And, who remembers that? Not many of us. And then you come out, blah, and there you are. And you go like, who? And they give you a name. You call Tom, Dick, Mary, Jane, Long R, Dingley, whatever. You get a name, you say, oh, that's me. Now, if they called you something else, that would be you too. But you think that's you. And you come when you're called, or run away when you're called, but at least you have an identity with a name. And then they tell you you're part of that family. And you go, really, do I have a choice? No, you don't. You're part of the family. You're stuck. And, we're all together for the end of time. Oh, boy, okay. So, and then you're part of this town and part of this religion and part of this ethnicity, and these are your brothers and sisters, and these are not, and these are okay to kill, and these are not. And you go and you get all this identity built up, and you realize it's pretty arbitrary. It's pretty capricious. I mean, suppose you got dropped out of that family at 2 or 3 and dropped into another family. Would you think, yeah, you'd think you were them then, right? So the idea of the self as some permanent, immutable, solid thing is absolutely a myth from a scientific point of view, from an emotional point of view, from every way you want to look at it. And even, from a very gross physical point of view, we are not the same people we were when we came into this world, or even when we came into this room tonight. There's been a significant amount of changes going on in the cells. And all of us are getting older by a half an hour, 45 minutes, okay? It's like a stick of incense. It's just burning down. However fragrant it is, pretty soon it'll be gone. That's that self. We actually hallucinate and think it's real. It's really funny. We do. It's like we're drunk and we pretend that this is real. And it ain't, okay? It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Of course it exists. But it exists in this constant, radical, scary flux. And as much as we want to hang on to it, we can't. So that's why that's called drishti. Now, recognizing that is a proper view. Now, not freaking out over it, that's drishti again. So you have to play with this a little bit. You have to sort of stay between two extremes here. So that's one. Also, that this thing that it's eternal is a drishti. So not only it's real and substantial, but then you go to the next step and say it's eternal. And, that kind of goes in the face of logic and reason and sheer observation, right? Well, it doesn't when we look at ourselves. When we look at other people, we say they're not eternal, they're passing, they're getting older and weaker, but I remain unchanging and the same. This is how the next level of myth works. And no matter how many times, day after day, we go in front of the mirror, we always look the same. We always look great. We really never see the wrinkles or the hair. And yet, if we were to take a photo of us 40 years ago and say, who's that? Was that me? And actually, psychologically and physically, it's really hard to find that me there. You think I can go back, but memory is a tricky thing. Memory is someplace you can never get back to. You go back there, it's not the same as when you left it. And so memory is even tricky. Memory is selective. And, so what is this eternal self? It's constantly changing and mutating cellularly and so forth, and pretty soon, poof, it's gone. Well, then you say, but there's an eternal soul self. See, that goes on. So I don't worry about that. That's the next drishti. So saying there's this eternal soul that goes on. Because the Buddha said, that's great, bring it, show it to me. Huh? Well, where is it? You guys are talking about left and right like you know there's this thing. No, that's how the conversation he had. He was real straightforward. And so, oh yes, soul's nice. When you die, you're in heaven with blah, blah. No, where's the evidence? They said, well, it's kind of tradition. Oh, so tradition is the evidence for it. That's solid, isn't it? Or this is what we were told to believe. Oh, that's good. Or this is what we'd like to believe. Oh, that's even better. And so because the Buddha himself never made claims for this and said there is not an eternal unchanging substance that goes on called the soul. But then he said, by the way, if you think there's nothing at all, that's also a wrong view. And if you think there's something eternal, that's a wrong view. So all these wrong views had to do with getting to some kind of tension of the human condition of not falling into either extremes, either an eternalism or a nihilism and so forth. So this is why the views become important here. Because at that level, having those makes a difference, not dogmatically or doctrinally, whether we're right or wrong, but psychologically and human-wise, whether we're cultivating towards something that's liberating and true, or whether we're just kidding ourselves. And believe me, kidding ourselves is easy to do. It's the big one. And this self-deception is called avidya. It's called woming. And not seeing things as they are is the wrong view. So view has to do not just with an outlook, but an orientation that sees things really clearly, unmediated by these opinions or these attachments. So it's not just an abstract sort of collection of propositions. What's your view on slavery? What's your view on women's rights? What's your view on the UN? Well, it's not like that where you just sort of, you're kind of holding them as neutral propositions, but these are charged interpretations of your experience. These are really powerful, and they're intensely shape your thought, your feelings, your emotions, and your actions. So these views aren't simply lightly held opinions, but these are that deep underpinning of really intensely held attitudes. Whether they've been well considered or not is not the point. They're really, really held by you. And in fact, you look at people, often these don't change much. I know people think education changes a lot, and information changes a lot. But if you go and you take polls and you can present facts, okay, well, let's just do one. Global warming. Now, there's people who have very strong views about this, one way or the other. And no matter how much factual evidence comes in, the view doesn't change. You're all aware of this, right? This is one of the things that political scientists wrestle with all the time. Well, if we just gave people the facts, they would change their views, and they don't. And some people have religious views, and no matter how much evidence and facts you bring to bear on it, they don't change that view. And so, what's going on here? Because it's not fact, data, mutable. And that's what it means, deeply held, almost beyond the reach of reason, logic, facts, or anything else. And that's, where I came from, that was called pig-headed or stubborn. But now we have different words for it. We committed, So recognize that the Buddha's not talking about something just religious or spiritual. He's talking about a deep psychological orientation we have to clinging to certain ways of looking at things regardless of the facts. So that self is one of those. If I brought in a panel, scientists and whatnot, and they talked about self, you would be convinced that there is no such entity. Science doesn't hold it up. Psychology doesn't hold it up. All the things that we bow to don't hold it up. And yet, we would walk out and say, still me and mine. It wouldn't change us one bit. Same thing has to do with drinking, smoking. You can get the facts out on people, and people don't change that behavior regardless. So these are what views are. They're really intensely held. And the Buddha also said they're deeply formed by and maintained by mental conditioning. In other words, the patterns of our conditioning, the way we look at reality and how we reinforce ourselves and who we hang out with, and even what we read and what we reflect on, reinforce, condition these views. And we avoid what challenges those. So much so that we don't even have to avoid them, because when they're right around us, we can tune them out. And so this mental conditioning means it becomes self-reinforcing, which makes them harder to challenge. Now, the thing that the Buddha was going on, which is really interesting here, he's saying this is a wrong awareness. That's another way of talking about it. Your awareness is not clear. It's wrong. It's off a little bit. It's a little bit distorted. It's primarily intellectual, but it bleeds into the emotional, because the difference between a strongly held opinion and then that next stage where you're ready to fight and die or push or get upset about is a very thin line. In fact, those are the ones that are the closest. The tie between the emotional and this intellectual on this level is very, very intense, very, very close. And that's why it can lead to really crazy behavior that's unthought out, but it's driven by a view that's very, very strong. Deus lavot is one of those. God wills this. Therefore, the next step on that charge is to do it without compunction, do it without any sense of something being wrong. But from the Buddhist point of view, it's a misunderstanding or awareness about an object or a principle that doesn't lead to understanding and liberation. See, this is the difference. It's not wrong because the Buddha says, here are the 10 rights and the 10 wrongs. It's wrong because in principle, it doesn't lead to liberation and understanding. So when we come back, it's actually orthopraxic again. So you could say, well, the views sound like they're orthodoxy, but it's not. They're only right or wrong in that holding to them behaviorally does not lead to your liberation and your understanding. That's what makes them wrong in terms of their view, not in their dogma. So this is why they're listed as klesha. They're part of klesha. Remember, klesha is all these negative emotional qualities. But here, wrong views is part of klesha because they obstruct understanding and liberation attainment. Not so much emotionally or even sort of impulsively, but actually in your intellectual orientation. So the Buddha does not simply talk about these as cultivation is all about emotional and feeling impulse, but it also has to do at some level of where your mind and your ideas are. Ideas matter. Ideas matter. It seems strange to say that these days because there's so much that's driven by impulse and feelings, but ideas, for good or woe, matter. Let me just give a rough example. Nuclear weapons began as ideas. The Holocaust began as an idea, an attitude, an opinion that taken further and further and further led to this ultimate solution. But it began with a distinction between self and other, between ethnicity and so on and so forth. And you see, so they start out seemingly innocuous, these ideas. But when over time, they can lead to really drastic things. So that's why the Buddha said, investigate in the smallest of places. That's where the Tao is. Not in the grand outcomes, because in the smallest of places where it begins, that's where it's going to lead. So he said the sage, and this is also from the Confucius, investigate in things in their smallest detail, because it's in these little bitty details and the intention behind them that lead to the great. And that's why they say a large vessel, eventually with little drops of water, will become full. And so these ideas, unexamined and long over time, can turn into really dramatic, both positive and negative consequences. So paying attention to these at the beginning is the whole key of what he's talking about. And that's what he means by mindfulness. So if I talked badly about mindfulness last week, I apologized if people are committed to mindfulness. I was merely trying to tweak it into something a little more, how should I'm going to get in much trouble again. Anyhow, mindfulness in this sense has to do with really knowing why you do what you do and really examining how thoughts, feelings, emotions, and ideas have consequences. And that's also one of the wrong views, is to deny causality. To deny that there's cause and effect between what I think, what I say, what I do, and consequences in the larger world. So that notion of denying causality is another wrong view. The Buddha said, you can do it, and you can cling to it, and you can probably argue it in a philosophical paper and get a PhD for it. But it isn't going to make a damn bit of difference because there's still cause and effect. The only difference is you'll be held to it by not claiming you're responsible, but you'll still be held to it. So this idea, he said, that's why a nihilist point of view that says nothing, nothing matters, there's no cause and effect, why nihilism is wrong is not because it's abstractly wrong, but because it leads to an amoralism that then leads you to do things that you feel you're not responsible for, and you are. And so he said, therefore, you never get liberation because you're not owning, you're not taking responsibility. He says, you are radically free, you can do whatever you want, but you're also radically responsible. Oh, I was liking the first part and not the second. So this is why, going into these views a little tonight, I didn't mean to push so long on them, but I think it's really important to understand this, because otherwise we think this is just an expression of an idea of opinion, but it's actually something much more profound. But again, the point I'm trying to make here is you can know these by directly understanding and observing your life and yourself. You don't have to know these through reading text or memorizing. You can understand self and not self. You can understand consequences simply by observing what's going on in your immediate environment and your relationships. And so that's why he says this is right here. That's the inward rather than the outward. And the outward is to deny that, is to say, well, it must have something to do with somebody else or some exterior force or powers beyond that control our destiny, or ET or whatever you're going with, or chance. So none of these are put forward because they don't lead to liberating consequences. Anyhow, enough for tonight. Next week, we're going to find out, and this is one of my favorite passages too, that the sutras themselves are also not, quote, divine text, but only created for human beings. And he says, without human beings, there'd be no sutras. And without human beings, there'd be no dharma, there'd be no need for it. Wow. Talk about dismantling one's own tradition here. Anyhow, okay, no interesting stories tonight to tell you. I won't tell you stories about my Irish grandma and her beliefs. Lest you go home and have dreams. Any announcements for tonight?
Hello. Tomorrow we have activity.
Much louder. That microphone doesn't do anything for this room.
Hello.
No.
Can you hear me?
Everybody outside in the world hears you, but nobody in here hears you.
Okay, I try my best. Tomorrow we have activity like usual. Daily meditation in the morning, 6:15 to 7:15, and in the evening from 5:15 to 6:15. 9 o'clock we have Universal Door Chapter recitation. 10:45 we have lunch. 1 o'clock we have the Buddha's name recitation. 3 o'clock calligraphy lesson. 6:30 evening recitation, and 7:30 will come down here the nuns from City of 10,000 Buddhas, and we have the Avatamsaka lecture. And also on Sunday we start the Guanyin session in City of 10,000 Buddhas, and it will be 7 days session. And on Sunday we have birthday Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva Guanxin Pusa, and if you want interested, please
There's
come.
a birthday party?
No, this is Ukiah.
Oh,
Yeah.
there's a birthday party in Ukiah.
Sorry?
Okay. I love parties.
Okay, bye.
Okay, we'll do the transference in English.
If people hear and see
Ding Li San Bao.